Food. That's what most of the world works hard to produce. And the hard work promotes fitness. Simple tools and techniques take effort. They help burn up the food energy they provide. What isn't burned up immediately is stored as a fuel reserve. It's stored in the form of body fat to be mobilized and used if the food intake drops. Feasting today helps the body deal with famine tomorrow. That's the eating pattern with which we all evolved. But now in the Western world, we've upset the balance. There are all kinds of pressures distorting our eating habits. For one thing, fashion may force some people to be too thin, unnaturally, sometimes even dangerously thin. On the other hand, because we now produce more food with less work, most of us are overfed and under-exercised. Too fat or too thin means trouble. Changes in the balance between energy intake and output reshape the body over a lifetime. A baby's main activities are sleeping and eating. Low output, high intake. The result? Baby fat. In adolescence, both intake and output are high, but so much energy goes into growth that little is stored as fat. Later, activity drops, and unless intake drops as well, or output is kept up with exercise, fat is stored. Middle age spread. Finally, old age brings lowered appetite and activity. Fat stores may wither or get redistributed. Fat thins out just under the skin, causing surface collapse and wrinkles. In our society, most people want to be slim, but too many seem pound foolish and far from calorie wise. A calorie is a measure of heat, of energy. Food energy can be released by metabolism or by burning. The bomb calorimeter is used to determine the heat potential in any one kind of food. A metal cylinder is placed over a food sample that's been carefully weighed. A thermocouple will measure the temperature change within the bomb when the sample is electrically ignited and burns in oxygen. The food's capacity to provide energy can then be calculated in calories. The calories come originally from solar energy trapped by growing plants. Plant-eating mammals repackage the energy as meat and milk, sources of protein and fat. Plant-produced fats, usually oils, have molecules called unsaturated, with fewer hydrogen atoms than the solid, saturated animal fats. Saturated fats are involved in heart disease, especially in the fat-clogged blood vessels of atherosclerosis. Fruit and vegetables provide carbohydrates, starches, and high-energy sugars, which the body stores in the form of fat. Most human diets lack the variety we've come to expect. Most are simple, starchy, monotonous. Famine is rarely far away, and feasts are few. In New Guinea, a pork feast is a mighty occasion. People of the Mendi come from miles around for this banquet of protein and fat. It's taken 5 years to assemble. Taking advantage of present abundance helps the body deal with future scarcity. But what if the feast goes on, and the famine never comes? In our society, it's so easy to overeat. Our food supply is abundant, reliable, and enticingly varied. We don't burn up much energy getting food or keeping warm, thanks to easy access to comfortable climates down south or in our heated homes. The result? An epidemic of obesity, with increased danger of heart disease, diabetes, gallstones. We may be killing ourselves with calories. For most, too many, but for some, too few. This is one extreme, anorexia nervosa, a relentless pursuit of excessive thinness, a psychological disorder known only in affluent societies, and 90% of anorexics are girls, some of whom reach the point of starving themselves to death. In between the extremes, what's too fat or too thin? How do eating patterns vary in other species and in other societies? A traditional Eskimo diet is high in fat, so why don't Eskimos gain weight? They burn the fat away, keeping warm, making up for food shortages. Their fat-rich diet stems from animals adapted to Arctic life. The harp seal's body is streamlined and buoyant, thanks to a thick, insulating layer of blubber just under the skin. It keeps the animals warm, especially the young. Small bodies lose heat more rapidly than large ones. And when a nursing mother doesn't take time to eat, the fat will feed the metabolic fires that sustain life and warmth. Desert animals may also carry fat reserves to see them through periodic food shortages. The camel stores fat in the hump on its back. Concentrating fuel reserves in one place keeps the rest of the body thin, speeding up heat loss and helping to keep the camel cool. The Nur live in the desert heat of the Sudan. Their distinctive body shape is a result of extremely scant reserves of fat. Here, evolution has given up the stockpiling of energy in favor of bodies that lose heat rapidly. For most people, gaining weight means filling out fat cells whose number grows larger the more we eat in childhood. Usually, by the time of puberty, their number is set for life.
I am known as Sweet Marie, the youngest fat girl on exhibition today. I weighed 6 pounds and 2 ounces when I was born. Now I weigh 723 pounds. I measure 28 inches right around here, and I measure more just above my knee than the average woman does around the waist. I'll raise my dress.
In the massively obese, fat cell multiplication zooms out of control. Everyone has cells that can develop into fat storage cells. They're called fat cell precursors, and such cells from the massively obese are being cultured at the University of Toronto. David Lau is working on a project headed by Dr. Dan Roncari.
Using the cell culture system, we found that fat cell precursors from massively obese persons replicate at an exaggerated rate in culture. And this was very interesting because we could reproduce this after the cells had subdivided several times. So the problem seems to be inherent in the cells and may reflect the operation of genetic factors.
So for the extremely obese, the tendency to have too many fat cells may be built in and independent of youthful overeating. A chance to study the later effects of childhood eating arose out of one of the tragedies of World War II. It was in Holland near the end of the war. In the confusion of the Allied invasion and the German retreat, the Dutch were brought close to starvation. But even then, records were kept of the birth and growth of children.
The mothers who were exposed to famine at the end of their gestation period or at the time of delivery gave birth to infants who at the age of 19 had a lesser incidence of obesity than general population. And this is probably related to the fact that these infants were subjected to caloric deprivation.
Fortunately, liberation brought the famine to a swift conclusion. An airlift of food turned it into a feast, and babies born at this time had more than enough to eat.
These infants were born to the first spring of plenty, the first spring of peace. And at that time, there was abundance of food, and probably they received more food along with their mothers at the end of their pregnancy. And because of this excessive, probably excessive feeding, they developed an excessive number of fat cells.
There are psychological factors as well. Adolescent obesity is one response to the pressures of growing up in an increasingly complex, challenging world. In some children, too many fat cells are produced by early overeating, and then the stresses of adolescence create even greater appetites that fill the extra fat cells up.
In here, not at your stomach, because it's not your stomach that wants the food. If your head has made up your mind.
Now there are summer camps specifically for teenagers with weight problems. They feature restricted diets, exercise programs, and counseling. They undoubtedly boost morale and provide incentives to take off some of the extra poundage.
And when I'm thinner, like my whole personality is different. And then when I start gaining back my weight, like I'm always depressed and everything, and it's so frustrating.
I just sit in my room. I don't go out Fridays and Saturday nights. I just feel that nobody would want to be with me, not even my friends.
When I come home from school, I'll start off fighting something small, but I can't stop. I can never stop. I start off to eat, and eat, and eat.
But you've been seeing a boy who has the weight problem. And
I know, and that helped me a lot this winter. I didn't put that much weight at all.
you, in other words, you and Ronnie was supportive of you, and that helped you.
Absolutely.
Maybe you should go out and get yourself a fat boyfriend.
The problem is, how long will all this effort be kept up? Many of these youngsters will be back next year, still fighting a losing battle.
One and up. Two more. Ready?
It's hard to reach the roots of problems with insecurities or poor self-image, but results can reinforce resolves.
Whoa.
How about 260?
Right.
Permanent weight loss means lasting new attitudes, not just changing lifestyles for the summer months.
Another one, 236. How much is that? 15 pounds. And I'd like you to meet the kids who've had the highest weight losses, and they're so phenomenal I want to share them with you. Mr. Tillum and Mr. Porter, please stand up. These boys lost 15 pounds.
Kim Alvey, 11 pounds.
For many people, keeping trim means lowering intake, increasing output, going to the Y. Balanced diet and exercise can also tip the scales against fat-related disease, especially high blood pressure and hardening of the arteries. The effort people have been putting into fitness programs since the late 60s, all the exercise, has produced a 15% drop in heart attacks. But some people just can't keep their weight down. Until recently, nothing worked for Bill Roberts, so he volunteered to take part in a study program at the Toronto General Hospital. There, under careful supervision, he dropped his food intake to 0. When Bill entered the hospital, he weighed 350 pounds. In just 7 weeks, he lost 70 pounds.
To start, it was 800 calories a day, strictly protein. I would have egg whites in the morning, tuna for lunch, and then one night I would have chicken. The following night I would have beef tenderloin. That continued for 2 weeks. And right after this 2 weeks of the diet, I went to strictly fasting. And I fasted for 5 weeks. Nothing to eat at all, except liquid, which was only water, and I would consume about 3,600 cc's or 4,000 cc's a day.
Dr. Errol Marlis is in charge of this fasting study.
It is a very difficult kind of treatment to engage in, and frankly it's just not safe. There are a great many potential and actual dangers in total fasting. We consider it to be safe under very close surveillance in hospital by experts.
Most extreme diets have only short-lived effects and can be downright dangerous. Statistics also show that few short-term group programs have a high success rate, partly because most people who join them have already failed to stay slim on their own. While Bill Roberts' doctors rigorously monitor his health, they also study how his body utilizes its stored fat when no food is coming in.
The body has an extraordinarily effective capacity for knowing what it requires in terms of calories and measuring the number of calories that are coming in as food, and any excess gets stored as though for a rainy day, failing to recognize that in the current affluence in which we live, rainy days are less common.
The heaviest man on record was Robert Hughes, 1,200 pounds, over 6 times his ideal weight. He died young. This man weighs over 450 pounds, and neither dieting nor exercise have helped. For him, the last resort is to have his eating capacity surgically restricted, with Dr. John Palmer operating at Toronto General Hospital. There's one operation that entails wiring the jaw shut and forcing a liquid diet. This one involves opening the abdominal cavity, exposing the stomach by penetrating a 10-centimeter layer of fat, then decreasing the stomach's capacity. This staple gun will put a seam of staples across the stomach walls, leaving only a small opening through which food can trickle. This is what happens. The line of staples will create a reservoir that can hold less than a cupful of food, so only small amounts can pass through the stomach at a time. For even heavier people, the length of the small intestine may be shortened, cutting down on the absorption of nutrients into the bloodstream. But neither the stapled stomach nor this bypass can reduce a massive weight to ideal proportions. Recently, scientists have been finding out more about how cold environments affect the metabolism of food, and these new findings may offer hope to the chronically obese. It has to do with how fat helps keep the body warm. Not white fat that insulates, but another kind altogether. This line of research includes a study conducted by Dr. David Foster and Lorraine Friedman of the National Research Council in Ottawa. A rat is kept in a cold chamber for several weeks to find out how its body adapts to low temperatures. The rat's oxygen consumption is a measure of how quickly its body is burning up food. At first, the animal inefficiently produces extra heat by shivering.
After the rat has been exposed for several weeks to the cold, it stops shivering, and yet it maintains its body temperature, the normal temperature, and so it has developed a new process, apparently, of producing heat.
An efficient process. A rapid increase in oxygen consumption shows that something in the rat's body has stepped up its metabolic heat production. But what part of the body? To find out, Dr. Foster injects a tracer into the bloodstream, radioactive rubidium, in tiny plastic pellets, less than a hair's breadth across. The heat-generating tissue takes more blood in order to get the extra food and oxygen it needs. So it's in that tissue that the bloodstream concentrates the tracer. Once the injected animal is exposed to the cold, its body is dissected into different tissue types, muscle, bone, and so on, and each is tested for radioactivity. And this is where the tracer accumulates, in a tissue that rapidly enlarges in the cold, brown fat on the rat's back.
There's a very dramatic increase in the amount of brown fat. It approximately doubles in mass.
Especially in young animals exposed to cold, this heat-generating fat grows more active and burns up food to keep the animal warm. But not in this genetically obese mouse. Its brother is normal, and at the University of Ottawa, Dr. Jean Hims-Hagen has found that while the normal mouse withstands cold, the obese mouse dies at just 4 degrees Celsius, in spite of its massive insulating layer of white fat.
Brown fat is defective in the obese mouse. It does not have the normal heat-producing mechanism which is needed to combat the cold.
Every cell contains tiny bodies called mitochondria for converting food into energy. In brown fat cells, that energy is heat. But in the obese mouse, these microscopic furnaces don't work. They don't burn up the food, so it gets stored as white fat. If defective brown fat causes obesity, will active brown fat burn excess calories away? That was a question asked by the Medical Research Council of Great Britain. Its answer was sought by Michael Stock and Nancy Rothwell.
If you feed the rat almost exactly what a human eats, a very nice, a very varied, and a very palatable diet, it will eat very large quantities of food.
You could increase food intake, and the rat would respond not by getting obese, not by laying down fat in the body, it would respond by increasing his energy expenditure, its heat production.
At the end of one of our experiments, we killed the animals that had been fed the cafeteria diet or the ordinary diet to see if there was any difference in the amount of brown fat. And sure enough, we found about 3 times as much of this tissue in the overfed rats that had stayed lean. And it isn't just an increase in size of this tissue, but it's also a change in activity. It's more active in the animals that have the very high rates of heat production. This is just the same as you find in animals that are adapted to cold. So it seems that brown fat is important, not just in keeping you warm, but perhaps in burning off extra energy that you don't need and avoiding obesity.
Some 10 years ago, we did some experiments in London on ourselves and on college students, in which we asked the students to overeat by at least an extra 1,000 calories a day to see what effect this would have on their body weight. And these experiments went on for quite a long time, 4 weeks, sometimes up to 8 weeks. And the surprising thing was that a lot of the students and ourselves managed to increase our food intake by this large amount, and we had very little effect on, it had very little effect on our body weight.
I consume what are considered by many people quite considerable amounts of food, at least 6 bars of chocolate a day in addition to all the normal food that most people eat, and I have difficulty in not losing weight rather than gaining weight. So, and many people in the general public have long suspected that there must be some other mechanism for altering body weight other than just food intake.
Is it brown fat? That's apparently what keeps human infants warm, especially premature babies. Brown fat has been found in their bodies, just as in other young animals. This heat-producing fat is active in the premature during the first weeks after birth, until feeding has time to build up white fat, baby fat, as an insulating barrier to the cold. But do human adults have brown fat?
Pathologists who've looked at bodies have found brown fat in the same areas as you find it in the rats and in the young baby. But this doesn't mean to say that it's actually active. Obviously it could be just there and not actually doing anything in the adult. And we tried to find some way of testing whether it could respond to stimulation, whether it could still be active in the adult. And what we did was to carry out an experiment on ourselves, in fact. And we took a drug which acts just like noradrenaline. It's just like the sympathetic nervous system, and it's known to stimulate brown fat in the rat. And we looked at the temperature changes after taking this drug on the back, and particularly on the back of the neck, where you might expect to find this tissue.
Infrared thermographs show that parts of the body did get warmer, just where brown fat is found in other species.
interesting that we found particularly large hotspots in me, which is perhaps interesting since I do eat a lot of food and don't get fat, therefore probably have a very high heat production. And although it's not certain yet, it seems that there may be something there in adult man that is like brown fat that you find in the rat, and perhaps this may be involved in the high rates of heat production.
There is still some dispute over the idea that brown fat warms human adults. Russian scientists say yes, and it's worth noting that their autopsy findings were based on people who had lived in the cold Soviet climate, in houses kept at a lower temperature than ours. Do our overheated buildings render our brown fat incapable of burning up the excess calories we take in? If we have brown fat, can it be safely stimulated to burn unwanted pounds away?
The question then comes, what is the cause of obesity? Because up to now, most people have been convinced and been led to believe that obesity really is just a result of gluttony, of eating large amounts of food. Now we know that there are probably just as many thin gluttons in the world as there are fat gluttons. So it suggests that obesity is not just due to eating large amounts of food, that there could be a metabolic defect, really a thermogenic defect, a problem in raising heat production in response to food. These studies do open up the possibility that we could have an alternative form of treatment for obesity, that there may be some way of stimulating the brown fat in obese people to help them lose weight. But this is a long way in the future, and certainly we don't know of any way in which we can do this in man at the moment. And so one's still faced with the problem, I'm afraid, for the obese person, that they've got to learn to live with a lower energy intake than other people around.
Dealing with fat buildup is the first side of the question of weight extremes. The other side concerns the problems of being thin. What happens when the body's fat reserves get used up? Some mammals lose vast amounts of weight every year. Humpbacked whales migrate all the way from Alaska to Hawaii to calve, and then go north again. The adults manage the entire 4-month period without eating. On the whole spectacular journey, they may occasionally swim through their usual food, crustaceans called krill, but they don't eat until they're back in Alaskan waters. Here they spend the summer months converting crustacean calories into fat. Females especially have to eat tremendous amounts to make up for having lost up to 10 tons in calving and nursing their young. Not wasting time or energy in food gathering seems to be the most efficient way to exploit warm southern waters for calving, as well as productive northern areas for feeding. With emperor penguins, it's the males that grow thin in the breeding season. They spend 2 months in -60-degree weather, incubating their mates' eggs without taking any food at all. By the time the females have come back from fishing forays and start feeding the newly hatched young, the males have lost up to 40% of their body weight. The mating game is hard on many males. Bull seals spend most of the rutting season defending their harems. They don't take time to eat. And it's the same for bighorn rams. The rut is a series of ritual battles. Eating is postponed, even when the battleground itself offers grazing. Mammals with small bodies make up for rapid heat losses with a high metabolic rate. But hibernating species conserve energy with a low winter metabolism that barely sustains life. That way they can live on fat stored during a summer and fall of overeating, and make their bodily reserves last all winter. Famine lowers immunity to infection, slows down growth, and may produce small-bodied adults. The young are most vulnerable to the dangers of drastic shortages. The fat reserves in their slight bodies are low to begin with. But what's the effect of malnutrition on mental development? University of Toronto nutritionist George Beaton.
It's known, for example, in experimental animals that if you impose a severe restriction of food, the number of cells in the brain will be reduced, as they will not increase the way they normally should. It's also known that if those increases in cell number do not occur at the phase of growth that they should, they cannot recover. The cells can grow in size, but not in number at a later stage. So it is clear in the animal and in the human that brain size can be affected by severe malnutrition or by severe infection. What is not clear is whether brain size really affects brain function.
What does affect brain function is the development of brain cell pathways, of learning, and that depends on active interaction with the environment. But in a chronic food shortage, most people try to conserve their energy.
One of the responses to malnutrition is a decreased activity, and that's becoming withdrawn from the environment. And the feeling at the moment is that that phenomena, the withdrawal of the child, makes worse this question of the interaction of the child and the environment, and probably has its effect on the development of functional pathways, albeit not necessarily development of the brain as an organ.
If there aren't enough calories coming in to form the body's everyday fuel, glucose, fat reserves are used to produce an emergency fuel called ketone bodies, which can suppress hunger pangs. The last defense against death by starvation is protein breakdown, giving a final measure of glucose, vital to the brain, when the body starts feeding on its own muscle tissue. Angus Barbieri spent just over a year without eating anything. He lost 2/3 of his almost 500 pounds, living on his fat reserves. At Toronto's Sick Children's Hospital, Stanley Zlotkin.
The length of period without eating really depends on what the person has to start with. If you take a tremendously obese person who has very plentiful fat stores, that person could last for months and theoretically even years on his fat supply, if in fact they were large enough. If you take a lean individual, this person would only be able to last for possibly as long as 60 to 80 days, and certainly no longer. The important aspect is that we must preserve, or man tries to preserve, the protein within his body. And once about 50% of this protein is used up, man no longer has the strength to keep on breathing, and death ensues very soon after.
Mahatma Gandhi used self-imposed starvation as a political device in the 30s and 40s, when he was trying to draw the world's attention to India's plea for independence. Gandhi always broke his fasts in time, and in the end, they achieved their purpose. There's been a modern parallel in Belfast with imprisoned IRA members. Ray McCartney, a convicted murderer, fasted for over 50 days.
We, my 6 comrades, are prepared to go through this, and we are prepared to die to prove that we are special prisoners and our 5 basic demands are just.
In 1920, Terence McSwiney was the revolutionary mayor of Cork. He went on a hunger strike in a British prison, and after 74 days, he died. IRA starvation symptoms hit the headlines. Partial blindness and nerve disorders caused by vitamin deficiencies. Encroaching weakness as protein is used up. And then, when the brain is starving for glucose, a final coma. McCartney gave up his fast, but since then, 10 IRA protesters wasted away and died. Deliberate overeating keeps these men fat. The sumo wrestlers of Japan. Huge meals keep up their fighting weight. Bodily ideals vary with different motives from place to place, through history, and by gender. With most men, weight and shape are usually the products of muscle development, but not with most women.
The female has a larger percentage of her body weight as fat compared to the male. And there may be a couple of reasons that would explain this. The first is there may be an aesthetic aspect of increased fat in the female over the male. It's difficult to give any definite scientific feeling about this aspect. A second possibility is that during the pregnancy, the female gains somewhere around 12 or 13 kilos, or around 25 pounds. Of this weight, only about 50% is the weight of the fetus and the amniotic sac and fluid. A good 2 to 3 kilograms of this weight gain during pregnancy is additional fat stores that the maternal organism takes on during this 9-month period.
The production of mother's milk uses up some of the fat reserves. The rest may be needed to sustain a new mother while she is recovering her usual energy and activity, especially if, for any reason, there's a food shortage. The tendency for the female body to be padded with fat has drawn attention in many ways. Primitive cultures often saw it as a symbol of fertility, the Earth Mother's ample curves. Medieval fashions favored delicate, virginal shapes, and medieval diets produced smaller statures than those seen today. While the figure fluctuated, diets improved. By Renoir's time, the full figure had made a robust comeback. And in this century, vogues have ranged from the almost boyish bodies of the 20s and 30s through various shapes designed to catch the masculine eye, to the lean, more athletic form of today's liberated woman. But still, there are pressures that deny the bodily shape provided by evolution. There are disciplines that dictate a loss of female fat. As a dancer, Caitlin Maggs must be particularly aware of her own body and of the special needs imposed by her profession.
Aesthetically, female flesh isn't in. It's not acceptable, and so everyone's dieting to keep it off. And it's hard to maintain it because basically you're maintaining an underweight. And as soon as you eat normally, the weight goes on instantly because your body is saying, I want to be heavier, you know, I want to be a woman. It's a struggle, and I mean, some of my friends, it became a real, psychological thing, you know, it really, I think, affected them in that they were really unhappy because they didn't feel what they were was good, you know, like it was bad the way they looked, and yet that was them. I had one really close friend in England who was just a little bit, maybe a touch sort of too much shape, but a beautiful dancer, and she started dieting, and usually you notice it when it suddenly becomes an obsession and the person just is getting thinner and thinner and is really into the whole thing. And she got extremely, extremely ill, and it got to the point where the school, you know, sent her home, and she couldn't come back for 2 months until she put on weight because she was just really ill, and then they discovered that she had anorexia.
That's what Julie has, anorexia nervosa, which means loss of appetite. But those who suffer it, although they refuse to eat, are always hungry. What causes this obsession? Social worker Libby Ridgely.
One attributes the enormous influence of fashion and its emphasis on being thin. Movies, magazines, particularly television, drums into you on a regular basis that one can be loved and respected by being slender.
Janet Pollavy of the Clark Institute of Psychiatry, Toronto.
It used to be that females were expected to be just super housewives and super mothers. Now they're expected to be super housewives, super mothers, and super efficient businesswomen all at the same time, I think that a lot of teenage girls, when confronted with this kind of expectation, are a bit overwhelmed and just sort of back off from it a bit and say, I'd rather not grow up just yet and have to be all those things. I don't really know who I am or what I want to be yet. And one way of backing off is to change your shape back into the shape of childhood. There are a lot of reasons. Other reasons would include avoidance of sexuality. And also, I think most of all, it's a cry for help. It's a way of saying, there's something wrong with me. Look at me. Please, help me.
Because I don't feel my life has any direction right now, and I don't know exactly where I'm going. And
you mean with your career? Or?
Yeah. And until I'm sure of myself and know what I want, I'm afraid to let go of it.
Of the anorexia?
Yeah.
How does the anorexia become sort of a protection, a coat of armor? That's sort of what you're using it for, right?
It's a way of control.
Controlling what?
Your life, I guess. Your
a,
body.
It's a way, certainly, of controlling your body.
Yeah.
It's not a way of controlling your life, unless you want to spend the rest of your life involved with hospitals and psychiatrists.
No, I don't intend to.
I was concerned.
The treatment of anorexia is a long and complicated process. Dr. Ronald Liebman of the Philadelphia Child Guidance Clinic is a pioneer of family therapy. Sessions involve Julie's immediate family to encourage them all to work out just what pressures Julie is responding to by eating barely enough to stay alive.
Was your husband involved in that at that time?
No.
Her weight loss at one point was so drastic she had to be hospitalized. It may have saved her life.
And
what was your weight before this all started, approximately?
The peak was about 97.
97?
Yeah.
How tall are you?
5'2".
What do you weigh now?
Hold me. That I don't discuss in front of my family.
Well, could you just whisper
What was
then?
the question? How much do I weigh now?
That you're
I
not
prefer that they don't know.
Well, okay. Do you mind if I know?
No.
I will not tell them. Well, can you just? Better be quiet. Approximately how long has that been?
I've gained like 5 pounds since April.
April of '79.
Right.
And you went in the hospital June of '78.
Right.
You were in for 10 months.
Mm-hmm.
When you went into the hospital, what did you weigh? Do you remember? Approximately.
61.
So you
That's
went from
my low.
97 to 61.
Right.
61 pounds and 5 feet 2 inches. You're lucky to be alive. You must have been grotesquely thin.
Yeah.
Were you aware of how?
Yes, I was.
An anorexic may be literally starving, but starvation distorts perception. That's one of the side effects experienced by many who are afflicted with this condition.
When an anorexic looks in the mirror, she sees something completely different than a normal woman sees. She sees a body which she thinks ought to be thinner. And it doesn't matter if in the last 6 months at 16 years of age she has lost 55 pounds, which is an enormous amount of weight. She still sees herself as being too fat.
Camera lenses that distort images help in the study of bodily ideals. People who are particularly aware of fat problems and dieting are termed restricted. Now, if a restricted mother is shown a series of baby images, she is likely to choose as ideal one that's been made to look thin. She may want her own child to match this ideal thinness. But if the baby in the series is her own, the image she recognizes as her own child is usually one that's been made to look fat. If she has a daughter whom she sees as fatter than her ideal, that may be the beginnings of the pressures that can lead to a young girl's anorexia. One of the most dangerous manifestations of anorexia is an eating pattern called bulimia, first binging on rich food and then inducing vomiting to avoid any weight gain. This can so alter the balance of water and chemicals in the body that survival may depend on immediate treatment to restore the balance. A limited diet can also lower the levels of sex hormones in the body and suppress the menstrual cycle, a phenomenon found in anorexia. and in some female athletes. Athletic prowess means replacing fat with muscle. But in a woman, if the ratio of fat to muscle drops too low, so do hormone levels. Ovulation may cease. This can be a form of natural birth control for people who face seasonal food shortages. Babies are rarely born during the famine, when families must be on the move to find new food supplies. There seems to be a feedback mechanism that suppresses ovulation before fat reserves are used up, which might explain why in some communities most births occur at the same time of year, when food is seasonally abundant. Some anorexics also experience this early onset of menstrual suppression, perhaps a holdover from some ancestral need. Diane is 17. Just before she turned 16, she was found to be suffering from anorexia. It became serious enough to have her hospitalized. She and her parents decided on family therapy to try to discover and settle whatever it was that was driving her away from eating and towards a thinness that was endangering her health. Diane's family therapy was conducted by Libby Ridgely. A therapist's approach may occasionally seem harsh, but the aim is to provoke reactions that will replace obsessive dieting with a less harmful and more useful life strategy.
So how many pounds have you lost since you've been discharged from the hospital? I was 114 when I left, and I'm 108 now, so I guess 6. I guess that's 6, yeah. That's getting very serious. Yeah, I was kind of worried about it when I got home. I was kind of upset. What are your thoughts about it?
Well, I'd like to see her get more, but Diane, it's up to Diane herself. She has to be her own judge, I think.
That's what I said.
Yeah, because...
I'm going to have to gain it back this week, some way or another.
How is it that it gets up to Diane herself? I mean,
well,
there are different family situations that can foster anorexic behavior. It may be a protest against overprotective parents, parents who avoid confrontations. The whole process of growing up and achieving independence requires some conflict. Refusing to eat can be a way of setting up the tensions that are missing. Emancipation through emaciation.
Always. So I guess this week it just hit me that she's right, and I got to start eating more, or I'm going to be in trouble.
What if Diane continues to blow it?
Well, when she gets to a particular weight, then she would have to go back into the hospital.
And you won't move in before then?
Well, apart from forcing it down, which I don't think I could do.
Why?
I don't know. I don't know really, but I just don't think I could do that. Sure, I could tell her she should eat more.
Well, I guess it's me that gets more upset than her father. He can calmly walk away, whereas I can't.
He doesn't yell at me. He just tells me.
He doesn't yell at you?
No. He'll just say, in a calm, cool, smooth, collected way, that bugs the crap out of me.
That bugs you?
It bugs me. I wish he'd scream. Why does he have to say, Diane? I think you should be cool. No, like, you could scream at me, Dad. You know, I would be able to hear you better.
How much weight would you have to lose before your father would scream at you?
He wouldn't. He never has.
At 90 pounds? You think he might?
He never did. At 78 pounds, he never screamed at me.
This is a well-protected daughter. Maybe she doesn't need such protection.
Now, after 6 months of persistent therapy, Diane is well on the way to recovery. She has a boyfriend. She's preparing to go to university. She's found how to stop being dependent on her family and on her self-imposed starvation. For the overweight, the best advice is still get enough exercise and eat a balanced diet that's less than you're used to, and perhaps less than most of your friends eat. You can also try turning down the furnace and take the chance that brown fat might help burn the pounds away. But if you're not prepared to change your style of living, you may have to accept the way you are.